Welcome to the Career Now podcast. I'm your host, Jed Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have Tim Shorrock. Now, Tim is a Washington-based investigative journalist who, over the past 35 years, has done a series of deep-look journalistic studies, often focusing on news source and previously classified information. And one of these areas has been the Gwangju Uprising. On the 26th of December 1979, Park Chung-hee, then president of South Korea, was assassinated, and his death came at a time of political turmoil. Korea had been an authoritarian government for almost the entirety of its existence. Following Park's death, President Cho took power, but he was almost immediately a puppet for Chun Doo-hwan, who was steadily positioning himself into power through control of the military and through the internal security services. Meanwhile, out on the streets across South Korea, there were pro-democracy protests almost every day. People demanding freedom of the press, human rights, democratization, and things like improvements in basic wages. And they were met with a crackdown. Professors, students, professional activists, and labor union leaders were expelled from their positions and occasionally locked up. And at the pointed end of this crackdown, this suppression by Chun Doo-hwan, was the imposition of martial law and the arrest of opposition leaders, such as future president of South Korea, Kim Dae-jung. And then, on May 18th, students in the southern city of Gwangju began gathering at the gates of Chongnam University. The protests soon shifted downtown, and what soon happened was a moment that has come to define South Korean democratic history, and in some ways the very meaning of South Korean modern identity. Through days of running clashes, these protesters were met by police forces, were met by the army, and were met by Korean special forces. The end result of which was a massacre, caught on camera just as the scenes in Tiananmen Square in China were, just as visceral, touching, and emotional. Yet unlike in China, this became the catalyst for democratic change inside South Korea, and also a series of recriminations, of questions, of doubts, of criminal trials, and of a deeper fundamental question of what role, if any, America played in this violent suppression. Now, Tim Shorrock was there reporting from these early trials. And importantly, since that early date, he has uncovered and worked through approximately 4,500 documents that he managed to obtain under the Freedom of Information Act from the US State Department. Tim's reporting gives a new insight into just what happened in those days, the mindset of the leaders involved, and how America involved themselves, or didn't, in the actions as they unfolded. Now, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. So if you do want it to continue, please consider donating at the Patreon account or the PayPal link attached below. On that, and to walk us through the complexities and the high-level decision-making behind the Gwangju Uprising, this is Tim Shorrock. Tim Shorrock, welcome to the Career Now podcast.
Thank you very much.
So you've done an awful lot of research into the Gwangju Uprising and an awful lot of unique research, this deep, archival research going through a whole series of declassified documents. And you've done a very unique insight into the American relationship with Gwangju and the American relationship with the South Korean military at the time as well. But most of our readers will know what the Gwangju Uprising is. But before we get into your research in its full depth, just take us out a little bit and just give us some of the context and maybe a broader paintbrush sort of picture of what the Gwangju Uprising was. What are we going to be speaking about today?
Okay, sure. Well, we have to go back to the fall of 1979, which was when, in October of 1979, Park Chung-hee, who had been the president and the dictator of South Korea for 18 years, was assassinated by his own CIA director, KCIA director, in the middle of kind of a popular uprising of students and workers against his dictatorial rule. And of course, this created an enormous crisis for South Korea and for the United States, which, at that time, as is now, South Korea was a very close military ally. And here you had the president of the country shot in the midst of in sort of a, near revolutionary situation where, people were really sick of a dictatorship and 18 years of repression. And so immediately martial law was declared, throughout the country except for Jeju Island, and the military, began to take a very forceful role. But there was sort of a situation where they were saying to the United States, okay, we're going to try to, we're going to try to create a situation where we will allow more democratic rights, lift some of the draconian laws and regulations that Park Chung-hee had imposed on freedom of assembly and freedom of speech, such as allowing students to organize their own groups and campuses, and allowing workers to organize unions. All this had been very difficult to do under Park, and so there was a kind of period of time when there was a lot of uncertainty. The military was taking steps to democratize or move towards some semblance of democracy. And there was, of course, a figurehead president, Chae Kyu-ha, who really didn't have much power. But not long after this assassination in December 1979, the general who was head of the Defense Security Command that was actually investigating Park Chung-hee's assassination, Chun Doo-hwan, took over the Korean military in what was really a coup within the military, where he, shot his way to power by directing forces from, actually, some troops came from divisions that were close to the DMZ, and they went and attacked the Seoul garrison where the head of the martial law command was. And, some people were killed. And as a result, Chun basically took over the military at that time. And so this was seen by the United States as really a serious problem, because, he had basically violated the joint command structure, the U.S. South Korean command structure that had been set up in 1978. And that caused a lot of alarm. And, when people in this, and the Korean citizens saw this going on, it really began to concern them that, there was kind of a dark hidden, military force wanting to take over again from after Park Chung-hee had been assassinated. And so throughout the spring of 1980, there began to be there was a kind of a soul spring, a spring throughout Korea where people were in this upsurge of organizing, and students, going back to campus and creating their own organizations and saying, no more dictatorship. And then, the same thing was happening with workers who had been repressed, who were not allowed to organize, and they began to, sort of seize their rights as well. And there was a whole series of strikes and walkouts, during the spring. And it began to be kind of, crisis proportions, and the U.S. began to be very concerned about the whole situation as well, because for the United States, they were dealing with, this is the Carter administration, they were dealing with this crisis in Iran, where there had been a revolution, a Muslim-led revolution, and their guy, the Shah of Iran, had been forced out, and the army in Iran, the military had split, and as a result, the U.S. has, then the students in Iran seized the American embassy, creating a enormous crisis for the Carter administration. And so, and then at the same time, there was severe tensions with the Soviet Union around it. I think it was around this time that the Soviets began making the invasion of Afghanistan, and there was a lot of tension with the Soviet Union. And so, for the Carter administration, they really did not want to have another crisis or revolution in South Korea. So they began to really focus on how they can sort of influence the political transition in South Korea. And the contacts that the U.S. had and the U.S. Embassy had were of course at the top part of the top rungs of Korean society, South Korean society, business, diplomacy, but they really didn't have a very good, clear understanding of the passion at the grassroots, and they were very distant from the actual demands and needs of what ordinary citizens wanted. After all, 18 years of dictatorship is long enough. And they didn't really get that. And so they really began to focus on who can they sort of work with in South Korea to sort of, create a sort of semblance of normalcy and democracy and lift the worst parts of Park Chung-hee. So this was the background. And then in April 1980, Chun Doo-hwan took control of the Korean CIA, and he became the head of the CIA. And this had never happened, where the KCIA was very powerful, and there had never been a top general in charge of it. It had always been a sort of separate organization from the military. So here you had a guy who had seized control of the military. He'd also seized control of the KCIA. And so this was a sign to many, many people in South Korea that, this new force within the military was going to take over and create another dictatorship. And so there began to be massive demonstrations throughout South Korea, particularly in Seoul, that basically shut down the whole city. And, these got very intense in April. And then, early May, they had a deadline. They said, if you don't announce a transition to democracy, we're going to have, just the whole country is going to turn out. And so, there was a crisis really building. And it was on May 17, Chun Doo-hwan and his top generals decided that the time had come to just declare martial law, and that's what they did on May 17. That night, they declared martial law. They sent military forces, to seize all the universities, and sent special forces all around to different cities to stop these demonstrations. And so, this was like, the whole country was basically shut down, and many people were arrested. The top political leaders at the time, Kim Dae-jung, Kim Young-sam, Kim Jong-pil, who was a conservative but was still seen as opposition to this military group, they were all arrested, and so you had this very severe crisis. And throughout the country, many of these student leaders were arrested, but in Gwangju, people kept demonstrating. And what I now believe is, what happened was Chun had sent special forces, who are, after all, these are, Special Warfare Command troops. They're trained to fight behind the lines in North Korea. They're trained to fight and kill North Koreans, not South Korean citizens. They were sent down and, told that this was, kind of a communist-dominated city, and Gwangju always had this reputation as a kind of rebellious city, going way back. For during the Japanese colonial days, there was a scene of, many demonstrations there against Japanese colonialism. It had always been a center of rebellion. And at Chonam University on May 18th, there was police there, of course, but the police in Gwangju were, they knew all these kids that were demonstrating, and they weren't willing to really, storm these students and beat them, and the police chief actually had them back off, and so at some point on that afternoon, the paratroopers were ordered to charge, and they began an incredibly vicious assault that lasted for several days, where they just they beat people to death. They stomped people to death with their boots. There was sexual assaults. It was just a terrible, bloody affair. And people were just completely shocked. I mean, if you read and you can see the films from that time of these special forces, chasing people through the streets and into their homes and dragging them out, beating them. And so it's not really known how many people were killed in those first days, but many, many people were injured. And after this went on, for a couple of days, with this horrible treatment of these kids, students that were out there. And this, of course, really aroused the citizens. They were just so angry seeing their young people being treated this way, and they just didn't understand what was going on. And after by about May 20th, people were like, massing against the troops, and weren't quite fighting back yet, but they were surrounding them and shouting at them, and they would be the paratroopers would charge. May 20th, there was a shootout. It was when the first shooting occurred. There's two young people, there were students were killed in front of the Gwangju railway station. And they were found the next morning very early, and people picked them up, the bodies, and put them in a cart and sort of carried them through the city to see, look, this is what these soldiers are doing to us. And this really aroused the town. And by May 21st, there was the entire city was really in rebellion, and there was several 100,000 people who were in the streets just so angry at these special forces of these troops. And then on May 21st, where the troops were kind of were by the provincial capital in downtown Gwangju, and it was on that day, May 21st, that they opened fire, and dozens were shot to death on the street. And if anyone has seen the movie Taxi Driver, very popular movie in South Korea last year, and it was actually shown here in the United States. There's amazing scenes of very dramatic and very realistic scenes of what occurred on that day when so many people were shot. So when that happened, when they saw they saw their fellow students and their fellow workers being shot like this to death and coldly killed in the streets, that's when people they raided some police stations that were nearby Gwangju, where there was arms, mostly old rifles, dating way back to the Korean War. People began seizing guns and started, drove back into Gwangju and started shooting at these paratroopers and shooting at the soldiers. And there were shootouts. And by the night of the 21st, the Chun decided to pull them out. So they pulled out the paratroopers. They basically, the citizens took over their own city, got the military out, and the military, South Korean military, put a very tight cordon around Gwangju, around the city and around some of the towns around it, and just closed it off completely. And so then there was this period of days when the city was liberated, and people felt like it was liberation, and they still celebrate May 17 as Liberation Day there. So it was an incident where people just had enough, and then they started being killed, and people decided we're not going to take this anymore, and they started shooting back, and they held the city, and while they held it, it was sort of it's been compared to a commune, Paris commune. People brought out water, and there's this famous art of the women coming out with rice balls and feeding the citizen army and feeding the people that were in the streets and demonstrating, and kind of a feeling of joy and liberation was there. And there began to be, they were negotiating with the martial law command, and negotiations basically, nothing. Chun was determined to shut this thing down, and the negotiations never really went anywhere. And by May 27th, the Chun's martial law command had decided, with the assistance of the United States in this decision, to use military force to come in and retake Gwangju, and that's what happened on May 27th. And so that early in that morning, some of the troops from the regular army divisions came down, but they were also aided and abetted in the front lines by the paratroopers who had done all this slaughter in the first few days. They were also there, and they killed all the people that were remaining at the provincial capital. And there was some of the surrounding buildings, the YMCA building, where there was some holdouts, and they killed them all and put an end to the rebellion. And basically, that was the end of it. But of course, as word trickled out, very little word trickled out. Actually, we knew more in the United States about what had happened than a lot of people did in Seoul, for example. For months, that was the case. And,
well, let's dig into that question about America there, though. A lot of your research has been accessing thousands of documents from the American archives, under Freedom of Information Act. So let's drill into one of those very first questions there, and then we'll build up this picture a little bit bigger as we go here. One of the first things that comes across, and this is, as you mentioned there was a certain amount of American involvement here. So what degree was America involved in these early times? Because I have these quotes here from some of your research where people like Richard Holbrooke are saying things like, when the dust settles, Koreans killed Koreans, and Americans didn't know what was going on and certainly didn't approve it. And people talking about, when it all settles, when it all dies down, nothing will come back to America, nothing will show us as being in any way complicit. So what exactly did America know in all of this? In what way were they involved? How do you see America's role in this, at least in the backgrounds of this process?
Right. Well, basically, as I was saying, the U.S. was very concerned about the situation, wanted to make sure there was a transition. But, you have to remember that South Korea at the time was a huge market for U.S. corporations, nuclear power, makers, reactor producers, oil companies, chemical companies. It was buying a lot of American products, right? And it was, and also South Korea was sort of, like, this is the 70s. This is a few years after Vietnam. The U.S. had lost the war in Vietnam. A lot of countries in the so-called third world were rising up against great powers in the United States. And so South Korea was kind of this example of a country where the U.S. had a close military relationship, and they would always say there's no anti-Americanism, but it was very profitable to U.S. corporations and banks. And also there was this very, very, tight military relationship that had just been restored with South Korea. And so the U.S. wanted to retain all these what they call national interests. And so a lot of American policymaking was bent on, preserving those interests in a way that they thought would not lead to an explosion, but would also maintain those U.S. interests. And so they were working with people that they thought would be offer the right sort of. They're looking for a third force. It was almost a classical Cold War situation where, in Vietnam, it'd be the communists versus, the people that supported the French colonialists. And the U.S. tried in Vietnam to find a third way between them, right? And so in South Korea, they tried to find a way between the extremists in the military, this Chun group, and then what they considered extremists on the so-called on the left in South Korea. They wanted sort of a middle ground. And so they became very concerned about these demonstrations. So what I first discovered when I got these documents, and it took me a period of years to get them, was that before martial law was declared, and this is what really ticked off Koreans when my stories came out, like about a week before martial law was declared, after this had been discussed at high levels in the Carter administration, the U.S. ambassador, William Gleistein, met with Chun, met with the Blue House, and said to them, the U.S. will not oppose the use of military force to stop these student demonstrations. In other words, they told them, we will understand if you have to use the military to replace the police because of these massive protests that were taking place in Seoul. And so they kind of gave them a green light, not for martial law necessarily, but to use troops to augment the police. Okay, and that was seen when those documents came out, and you can read the quotes in my stories, I mean, that really shocked a lot of Koreans, many years later. But in fact, that's what they did. They said, look, we will understand if you want to mobilize the military. Now, that was, to me, that was like an initial kind of intervention the U.S. did at that time. Now, the U.S., to be clear, the U.S. did not have advance notice of the martial law declaration on May 17th. The U.S. did not know, of course, or did not give orders for a massacre to take place in Gwangju. That was in fact, Korean generals and, colonels and, officers telling the soldiers to do what they did. That was not a U.S. decision. But what I consider the second intervention that the U.S. made at this time was, once the rebellion was in full force, the U.S. made a decision, and I have written about this a lot as well, and I found the minutes to this meeting at the White House on May 22nd, which was the day after. It was actually only really a few hours after all these people had been shot to death on the streets of Gwangju, and the U.S. knew that these people had been shot to death. They knew Chun was behind these massacres. They still decided, knowing all that the U.S. had no choice but to help the South Korean military put down this citizens' uprising with military force. And so they began meeting they were, talking with the martial law command. Chun was running things as, head of the military, but there was a general who was the general in charge of martial law. There was other senior generals that the U.S. was meeting with. And of course, there was John Wickham, who was the U.S. commander at the time. And another person who played a big role in all this was Robert Brewster, who was the CIA station chief. So they were meeting with these Korean, military leaders. And this came out later in the hearings that took place after democracy in 1989. Around May 24th, so I said, the military withdrew from Gwangju May 21. By May 24th, about 2 days before the onslaught came from the military to take the city, on May 24th, the U.S. actually asked the South Korean military to hold off on retaking Gwangju until they had the proper military assets in place. By that, they sent an aircraft carrier and a bunch of other ships. They sent spy planes from Okinawa. And, they had to get, U.S. military assets in place, because at this May 22nd meeting, the U.S. had information from the Defense Intelligence Agency and the CIA that this could become a nationwide rebellion, uprising. And so at this meeting, they make it very clear that if that was to occur, the U.S. would actually intervene even more militarily, would bring more forces into South Korea to stop this. And so, they were working closely with the military on how to put down the rebellion. And so that's what I consider like it was sort of a two-pronged thing. So literally, those officials who said, it was Koreans killing Koreans and Americans didn't do it. Literally, that's true, but in fact, there's deep complicity here. I mean, the U.S. had choices that it could have made. It could have been ended very differently. The U.S.
Another one of those choices that you mentioned there, and is sort of pinging in my ears as you mentioned it, if we wind back just a little bit, is Chundu-1 and the support for Chundu-1. As you mentioned there, this is a Cold War context. But yeah. America, of course, throughout the Cold War context and throughout these times, they were, of course, trying to get allies, and allies were the most important thing. But they were, in many ways, also committed to democracies and liberal democracies. And from your reporting, it seems to be the case that there was some consternation in America when Chun came to power and the nature of his military coup. So how did America look at this? I suppose it wasn't a return to dictatorship so much as a continuation of dictatorship, but it was a drilling down into dictatorship in the face of democratic uprising. So how did America see Chun, and what support did they give his particular government?
Well, they knew that he was the cause of this, and there was a lot of, they were really angry about what he had done, and kind of disgusted with him, But at the same time, they saw him. They knew he was in charge of the military and that he had taken clear control of it, and so they sort of they went along with that situation. I mean, I still looking back on this, his violating the command structure to me was, I can't believe that the U.S. allowed that to happen, or it didn't make a major statement about it at the time, because they made a deal of, and I've written about this in some of my articles. They made a deal with Chun and the South Korean government that was supporting him to sweep that whole December 12th rebellion internally in the military, under the rug. And they said, as long as that doesn't happen again, we'll be working with you. And so it was kind of a sort of a hands-off kind of thing. But, at the same time, the way I've heard people in the CIA just say this straight out, and this was clearly the thinking, was they believed that South Korea at the time, there was no institution, no people ready to sort of take over running the country except the military. They thought the military was the only institution that could hold the Korean society together at that time. And so they said, well, we really have no choice but to go with this. And, one of the things I find, most shameful about this period of 1980 in Gwangju and afterwards is that the U.S. never demanded sort of, what happened in Gwangju? Why did you guys, what led to the slaughter? How did this happen? After all, it's a joint command. This is a binational command, a military command, and forces under a U.S. general who runs, the command in times of war, were used to kill South Korean citizens. This command is supposed to protect South Korea against, at the time, against the North Korean invasion, and they were used, to repress their own citizens. And so, I think that just Carter and his people, Holbrooke in particular, Brzezinski, they just held to this hard line, and they just felt like we have to hold our nose and support this military repression. And afterwards, by August of 1980, they were willing to go along with Chun becoming, taking over as president. So, I think that the Cold War had a lot to do with it, but clearly other choices could have been made.
Well, let's talk about another one of those choices then, because through a lot of your reporting here is another element that keeps coming into, it seems to keep coming into American decision making, and that is the concern over the signal that is being sent to North Korea. So let's talk about the specter of North Korea over this. You did mention at the start there that there's always been this stigma against the not just Gwangju but the broader South and North Jeolla provinces, that they are hotbeds of communism, whether that's right or wrong. But there was a concern here that there was the wrong signal being sent to upwards across the DMZ to North Korea.
Right. Well, as you know, being in South Korea, there are people on the right that say that, the North Korean, military was involved in the Gwangju Uprising, and they've made, outrageous claims about some of these citizen soldiers were North Korean colonels and so on. Of course, the U.S. was concerned, but throughout all the documents I've gotten, they're always saying things like, yes, North Korea, may or could, it's possible under certain circumstances they could intervene, but there was never any intelligence that they even planned to do that at all. And there was no, when Chun, of course, Chun Doo-hwan, after this happened, he justified what he did by saying, we were afraid North Korea was going to invade. Well, the U.S. at that time, to counter Chun, said very publicly that there was no signs of any unusual troop movements in North Korea. In other words, they didn't move, any kind of, infantry or anybody that could, just north of the DMZ. There was no movements down south, nothing like that at all. And I think one of the documents I discovered, sort of rediscovered when I was in Gwangju 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, when I was, working at the archives there, was a meeting at the DMZ, regular scheduled meeting between, U.S., but they're, under the rubric of the UN command, right, where they would meet regularly with North Korean officers. And there was actually, the North Koreans, made it very clear that they weren't interested in, if there had been any kind of incursion by North Korea, the U.S. would have made it clear to the North Koreans at the time, warn them about it. And there's also documents I got where apparently the CIA had picked up information, perhaps, signals, intelligence or something about a meeting that Kim Il-sung, the leader of North Korea at the time, had around the time of Gwangju, when they pondered the idea of intervening, but only if there was like a total revolution in South Korea and it was about to be crushed by the military. That's when they might consider intervening. But short of that, they said no. This is a domestic issue, that's going to be resolved by South Korea. And so there was no evidence whatsoever of any North Korean involved in planning, individuals, anything like that. That did not happen. But of course, the U.S., when it put its military assets in place, and it wanted to make sure that there was no, crossing of the border or, going down the seacoast and coming in through, the coastal areas, near Gwangju or something like that. So they were, closely monitoring the situation to make sure of that. But basically, that just North Korea was really not a factor at all in terms of any kind of military action or support for what was going on there. So, I think that I don't know how much the Korean right is pushing this idea anymore. But when I was there a couple of years ago, they were really, there's films about this, and they would try to make this case that Gwangju was a pro-North Korean uprising, which it was not. And you can read in my documents, and like they're now all stored at the Gwangju archive down in Gwangju. You can read, DIA reports saying, these people they're not pro-North Korean. They were rebels. They're not pro-North Korean. They're not pro-communist. They're just citizens of Cholanando that couldn't take it anymore. And that's what that's what any plus, any Korean, but also many, the Americans who were there in Gwangju, they said the same thing. So North Korea was just not a factor. But of course, strategically, the U.S. purpose of the U.S. forces in South Korea is to protect against a North Korean invasion. So they had to make sure all that was in place to make sure there was no incursion or anything like that.
And there is another element that comes in here. And there's a concern in some of the language of some of the people inside the American administration that Chun Doo-hwan is in many ways trying to manipulate them, or at least drive them in certain directions and drive public opinion. I have a quote from Mr. Gleason here, who says there's a deliberate effort on the part of Chun Doo-hwan, of the Chun Doo-hwan group, who are determined to manipulate American public opinion. And there are some other elements that come into this. There is a $600 million loan guarantee that is given to the Chun government as well at this time, which is in some ways considered a support for his government and a support for his actions and things like this. So how much of a Machiavellian do you think Chun was? Did he manage to manipulate the Americans? Did he manage to play them off against their own public opinion, or just play on their sensibilities about needing to put down a dangerous uprising, so to speak, and keep things calm and stable in the face of a Cold War threat? Or was it, or do you see this differently? What role did Chun have in this regard?
Oh, he was a master manipulator, and also he and the people surrounding him provided the U.S. with all kinds of disinformation. I mean, they were giving them, like there's reports that I quote, that the U.S. somehow State Department picked up and CIA picked up of. At one point, like there's reports of, they said there was executions in people's courts in Gwangju. Nothing like that ever happened, even remotely. And but this kind of disinformation came from Chun. And so, he manipulated the U.S., which of course was afraid of, an uprising, people's uprising, let alone a communist uprising. And he made some officials, believe that South Korea was on the verge of that kind of thing. And so he also was very clever in the way that he would bring in the military, U.S. and South Korean military, of course, have been very close since the Korean War, right? And so you have all these relationships between generals and colonels on the South Korean side and the U.S. side. And so like American military, former officer, U.S. military, generals, people were coming into Korea in the spring of 1980 to tell Chun, oh, look, don't worry about Gleistein and these like State Department guys. We're going to support you no matter what, this kind of thing. So also there was elements of the U.S. military that was, siding with Chun around the backs of the diplomats and even the CIA. And, I remember one of the cables I found, Gleistein was really angry because I think it was General Stilwell, who had been a commander in Korea before. He was there, basically meeting with Chun and saying, no worries, we're going to back you, don't listen to Gleistein. He's just some wimpy liberal or something. We're going to back you up. So he was good at manipulating the U.S., but in the end, they knew very well he was the problem. And like one of the recent findings I've gotten was when I was working in 2017 with MBC Gwangju, the television station down there, and a reporter named In Jong Kim, and she and I did a lot of research in 2017, and I helped her set up some interviews in the U.S. with some of the participants who were part of the U.S. decision making in 1980, and she interviewed this one Pentagon official who was in this crucial meeting on May 22nd, and in the interview he read her his notes that he took during this meeting, and they're really quite amazing notes. Because the statements by Warren Christopher, who was the Deputy Secretary of State, saying Chun is the problem, and is there any way that Chun could be some military officers in South Korea could overthrow him or something? No, that's not going to happen. Okay, well, I guess we have no choice but to do this. And this official told us that in that meeting, there was a special liaison set up between the Pentagon, a very senior U.S. general General Vesey, who was about to become head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was named the personal communication link to Chun Doo-hwan after that. So they had very close communications with him. So on one hand, they were manipulated by him. On the other hand, they worked very closely with him. So there's kind of a hypocrisy there. But that was the situation. And I think that, they really tried to downplay this close relationship. And of course, at the time it was known that when the Korean Army retook Gwangju, Chun made it very widely known that, General Wickham had released troops under the Joint Command to go down to Gwangju and take over the city again. And this was broadcast all over, and so people knew this. And that, that was a kind of manipulation too, because, the U.S. thought this would be, kind of secret, right? And Chun made it very public. Of course, he was, on the other hand, he was being, honest and straightforward, because the U.S. military did give that did give that permission. And of course, there's people dispute that. They say, well, the U.S. can't really give permission, but yes, they can. I mean, if the U.S. had made it clear that, no, you're not going to move troops that are supposed to be on the border with North Korea, the DMZ, you're not going to move any of those troops down to put down this uprising. You're going to deal with it some other way. That's not what this joint command is for. You know, I think that kind of decision could have been made.
And how much of a mistake do you think it was for Ronald Reagan to bring Chun Doo-hwan to the White House in 1981? So this is the first official visit of a foreign head of state to the White House under Reagan. Now, of course, the uprising was under Jimmy Carter, but you have a quote here. It's a very strange quote from a State Department official, and it says, "Remember, that's Reagan's effigy hanging in Gwangju, not Carter's." And he's making reference to this, I suppose, a deep animosity inside Gwangju, that Reagan came in after Carter, looked at what had happened, and then still went ahead and supported, not just supported Chun, but embraced him in many ways.
Well, so many South Koreans felt betrayed by what had happened, in 1980, and then to have the man in charge who oversaw this murder in Gwangju and the repression, to see him invited as a friend to the White House was just the deepest insult. So people really, really hated that and never forgot that. And I think that it was a deal that was set up by Richard Holbrooke. I mean, he negotiated with the incoming Reagan administration because they were about to execute Kim Dae-jung, right? So they were holding him hostage basically, and the deal was, you don't execute Kim, and we let you come to Washington. And that was a rather cynical deal that was signed, but that was the way Reagan believed that he had no choice but to. That's how they could save Kim Dae-jung's life. And I think a lot of people within Reagan's circle earnestly believe that. And as much as I am critical of Reagan's foreign policy, I have to say that it's very interesting that 7 years after Gwangju, in 1987, when there was a near, when South Korean military officers and Chun were once again contemplating a coup, a military coup to shut down these massive pro-democracy demonstrations that shook the whole country that year, that Reagan sent Gaston Seeger, a high-ranking State Department official, and he basically told Chun, if you do another coup, you lose U.S. support. They were very blunt with him. And so I think by that time they had learned their lesson, and it's in that context, I've been doing some research in the CIA archives lately, and there's a new online archive where you can find a lot of declassified documents. And I found this amazing report from 1987 November about the South Korean military, written by the Directorate of Intelligence of the CIA. And it was looking towards the next, the 88 presidential election, where, of course, No Tae-woo was one of the generals that took power with Chun, eventually won that election. But like this report, it's so clear how much destruction Chun Doo-hwan did. I mean, like they talk about, the tarnishing of the military's image, the result of its close association with a highly unpopular rule of Chun Doo-hwan, and the army's brutal suppression of riots. They still call them riots in Gwangju in 1980. And this report actually has a special section called "The Legacy of Gwangju," which is kind of astonishing when you look at it, when you consider how much the U.S. had denied in the past, because this makes it very clear that it says the military's reputation was badly damaged by the army's role in suppressing riots in the provincial city of Gwangju, and they talk about how many people were killed. And then they say in Gwangju, most citizens remain bitter toward the government and the military as well as the United States because Chun used troops from the 20th Division, which is under the Combined Forces Command. So the CIA knew very well, 8 years later, tremendous damage had been done to both the reputation of the South Korean military as well as the United States. for being, supporting it during that time. So, I think by the late 80s, the U.S. had perhaps learned a lesson about what had happened.
So you did mention there that Kim Dae-jung was almost executed. But
yes.
Let's wind this forward just a little bit here, because that's quite extraordinary, because in many ways, a few years later, and this begins to tie things up a little bit here, in many ways, he saves the lives of, or at least the prison sentences of Chun Do-won later on, at least through his advice and Kim Young-sam. So let's wind us forward to those charges, to that court case, because this is quite an historic moment here, of course, because this is the Chun era ends in 88, and then you have a transition, and once again you have a peaceful transition ever since. And but then in 1996 you have a trial of the Gwangju massacre, and you did a lot of your reporting at the time of the trial. So let's walk us through the trial. How significant was it, and what did it show, and what do you make after the fact of the I suppose the official pardons of the two men involved, or the two men that were charged, the two central men charged, under the idea of I suppose national reconciliation?
Well, the trial, they were tried on charges of subversion and murder, I guess treason, and they were convicted, but they were never. Nobody was ever convicted for the actual, murders, the shootings. There's never been any findings of, who gave the orders. Chun, of course, denies giving the orders. Somebody gave the orders for those paratroopers to shoot on May 21st. I mean, there's no doubt about that. As you know, in, recent years, there's been findings by the South Korean military, which, formally apologized about a year and a half ago, right? The South Korean Minister of Defense under Moon Jae-in, and they also found that many women had been raped, including young women who were students, subjected to sexual assault. The military said, acknowledged November. This was this year, just a few weeks ago, that the Korean military inflicted unspeakable deep scars and pain on the people of Gwangju. So, there's been a kind of reconciling to what happened and some justice done. I mean, I have to give it to, Kim Young-sam and Kim Dae-jung. I mean, they pardoned these people. I don't think they should have, because Chun has never, never admitted any culpability here. He still, defends what he did, and still, is outraged at some of the things he said. He's been sued for, things he said about the victims. And this man is just a despicable man. I mean, he never took responsibility for it. Always defended his actions. And I think that it was a real act of Christian contrition on the part of Kim Dae-jung to advise him to do this, because after all, Chun really wanted him dead. One of the other interesting things about the CIA report that I just mentioned, 88 report, is that the CIA openly says, if Kim Dae-jung, this is 88, so this is like 8 years before he became president, but they said if he ever becomes president, starts carrying out the policies that he said he would, during the 70s, that the military would stop him from becoming president. So this man, Kim Dae-jung, was not popular at all, with the Korean military, and he knew it. I knew Kim Dae-jung a little. I met him numerous times when he was in Washington in exile, and I interviewed him once. I think I'm the only journalist who ever interviewed him actually about U.S. responsibility in Gwangju. And in that interview, in 1986, he said to me, the U.S. made serious mistakes. He said the Gwangju people kept order. The Korean military did not keep order, and the U.S. should not have supported them at the time. So it was really quite an act of him to push for them to be released from prison. But I think I don't know about No Tae-woo, what he has said publicly, but I know Chun has never acknowledged any wrongdoing.
And you did mention there your reporting. So this might be a very good time to bring in some of the reporting you did, because you were there on the ground for much of this. And as we mentioned, you've gone through an awful lot of these documents, but you have a very, I suppose now, a very personal history with Gwangju, and an awful lot of, I suppose, unique awards and unique appreciation coming your way from the citizens of Gwangju for this reporting and for your work on this. So let's take us through that and your personal affiliation with Gwangju.
Well, I feel like I've been working on this issue, writing about it almost, my entire adult life. When it actually happened in 1980, I was a graduate student at the University of Oregon, and I was writing my thesis about, South Korean labor movement. And as I was doing this, as I was writing this, I lived in Korea as a kid. I'd been there in 1960 when Syngman Rhee was overthrown, and that, I remember that very clearly and what happened during that time. But so in 1980, I was like paying, very close attention to what was going on. And I was also working for a church, faith-based human rights group that had strong connections with churches in South Korea and Japan. And so I was getting direct information through the churches about what happened in Gwangju almost, immediately. So I've been following it, since then, and I've been on top of it since then. I've been, and my stories were actually, what happened was in 1989, when the South Korean National Assembly began to investigate this, what happened in Gwangju, they asked the U.S. to send Gleistein and General Wickham to testify, and the U.S. George H.W. Bush administration said no. But they put together a white paper, and out of this white paper of the U.S. policy in Korea at the time, I tried to get every document that was mentioned, or that's how I got all my FOIA documents, was based on the white paper. So my articles, when they came out in 1996 in the Journal of Commerce and CISA Journal, they ran in a 4-part series in CISA Journal, which was very widely read in South Korea at the time, and still is. It's called CISA-in now. But these had a huge impact. And later, when I went back to South Korea, starting, 5 or 6 years ago, a lot, I learned really for the first time how people told me, even Moon Jae-in, the president, told me this, how much my articles influenced their thinking on the U.S. Because it showed a side of the United States that people sort of, were suspicious about, but this showed in, black and white, what the U.S. decision making was like, and it gave a whole different texture to how they, how they thought about the United States and the U.S. role in Korea, and I've been, and so probably because of that, in 2015, the city of Gwangju decided to award me with an honorary citizenship, and I went there and I thought, this was a great honor, and I was amazed to get this. And I think it was a year later, I was invited with other what they call 518 journalists, some journalists that were actually there during the uprising. I wasn't there during the uprising, but I visited Gwangju for the first time about 8 months later. And they honored us in a very sincere and really wonderful way. And they felt, I remember seeing the movie The Taxi Driver, and when the German photographer was, trying to get out, that was taking pictures and filming what was going on, and people were coming up in the street and saying, you must tell our story. You got to get this story out. And he did, and he showed the world what happened. I mean, his films. I mean, I saw his films on television in the U.S. That he got out, and what a courageous man he was, and the taxi driver that helped him get there. But I think that there's a real sense of appreciation of journalists, American journalists, who are willing to really challenge the policies of their country. And in support of the Koreans really wanted democratic society at that time, and it was denied them.
So that might be a very good point to ask, I suppose, a final question just on that. Actually, you just said Koreans really wanted democracy and it was denied them. So
And you mentioned A Taxi Driver, which of course is an absolutely fantastic movie. It did come out. I watched it. It's going to bring you to tears, anyone listening. But it begins to ask some questions, I suppose. It is a modern movie looking back on Gwangju, and that's what I might get you to do now, and look back on the legacy of Gwangju and how you see it surviving today. Because Korea, of course, is a very different society. It has gone through a series of democratic transitions since then. You have politics swings back and forth, just like it does in many other countries. But it also, in many ways, they keep looking back. As you mentioned, the military has recently apologized for its role. Moon Jae-in launched a new inquiry into Gwangju. This is one of those issues that doesn't seem to die away. So how do you see the legacy of the Gwangju Uprising? Because when I look on your website, you have a fantastic series of photographs that really capture the actual images there. They're absolutely amazing. And I will link your website to this podcast so people can go and have a look at themselves. But of course, it reminds people of images of Tiananmen Square. And of course, Tiananmen Square didn't lead to anything. But Gwangju, in many ways, people think did. Of course, it was suppressed, but people think it really did lead. It really was that spark. So how do you look back on Gwangju now? And do you think it is something that was fulfilled, or something that is still struggling? People inside Korea are still struggling to find a place for it? Or do they see it as this the first great beacon of democratization?
I mean, I see it as one very important step on the march to democracy since 1960, when the Korean people overthrew the Syngman Rhee regime. I mean, there was a period of about a year after that where, people were talking about a neutral Korea, unification. And then, of course, there was a military coup in 1961 that shut it all down. Any discussion like that. But, so 1960 was a people's uprising. I think, 1980 was a continuation of that. And then, the uprising in 1987. And then, of course, the Candlelight Revolution, a year and a half, 2 years ago. It's just where the, South Korean people have, stood up and really, taken history by the neck and just, seized their democracy by their own hands. That's where I see Gwangju as just, a symbol of that. That, really insistence that, yes, we are ready for democracy, despite what anyone says. We want a democracy. Of course, democracy is difficult and hard and so on, but they wanted the freedom to be able to say and speak what they wanted, and to, run their own organizations and associate with the people they wanted to and all that. But, I also see it through these years as one of the most important rebellions of the Cold War. I mean, in the United States, the Cold War, if you ask about a rebellion during the Cold War against a superpower, everyone, will always say, Hungary, 1956, Poland, it's always against the Soviet Union. And those were, true rebellions against the superpower. But this was like one of the only rebellions against the United States as a superpower. It wasn't directly against the United States. It was an indirect, rebellion. It was a direct rebellion against the Korean military that was supported directly by the United States. And so I see it as a very important, part of that, where a lot of people, during the Cold War did not want to be controlled by a superpower, and in this case, by the United States. And that's where I see it. It's it really is. I think it needs more attention, actually, from historians, because when people do look at the Cold War, South Korea is rarely considered. I mean, there was, of course, rebellions against U.S. governments, U.S.-supported governments in El Salvador, Nicaragua, and particularly in Central America, other places as well in the Americas, but not so much other parts of the world. I mean, you might look at the Philippines, where there was an uprising against Marcos in the 80s later on. But I think that's what Gwangju, I think, is symbolic of. And, they stood up against a military that was supported by the most powerful country in the world, the most powerful military in the world. And they pushed that military out of their city and they liberated their city, but they were crushed. But the spirit of it lived on. And I think it still lives on. But I also see in Gwangju, there's still, it really ripped apart that city. I mean, there's still, people feeling, there's still a lot of feelings of, there's a lot of pride there. I mean, I heard people, I was there for 2 months in 2017, and heard a lot of people speak in forums in different places. And I remember there's one forum, and somebody was saying, hey, look, we're the only people in South Korea that picked up guns against Chunduan. So they're very proud of that they fought back. And you see it when you go to the Gwangju cemetery, and you see these amazing statues of the Citizens Army. And so there's a certain kind of pride in that. But there's also, the trauma of that repression is still very strong there. I mean, people were really traumatized. There's still people there that are traumatized. And I think that's why there's these, grief PTSD centers, have been set up there, because, I mean, this is a terrible thing to live through. So that's how I see the legacy, one of real pride, a symbol of a sort of a people's revolution. That was a democratic revolution at heart, but also something that really was very damaging to the psyche of Gwangju residents, as well as to South Korea. To be betrayed by a lot of people saw the United States as this friend who supported them during the Korean War against the North Korean invasion, and felt they really felt the United States was their friend. And then this happened, and they felt abandoned, and I think there's a real tragedy in that. That still makes me sad. I think wrong decisions were made, and we were complicit in a really terrible thing that happened.
And on that, I suppose that's a good spot to leave the podcast on. But as I mentioned, I'm going to link your personal website to this, and I encourage people to go there. It is full of reporting, and it's full of, I suppose, fantastic imagery. I mean, I suppose fantastic's not the right word for it. It's all quite haunting and daunting, but it is quite, it's certainly worth looking at. But you also have a republication of I suppose, a famous book on Gwangju coming out. So I might get you to introduce that book and your role in it, and when we can expect the republication.
I think it's going to be out. It's going to be published by Verso Press, which is in New York, and I think it's going to be this year. I'm not exactly sure when. I just finished. It takes months and months for a book to come out after you're done with it. But I just finished my chapter. My chapter is kind of an epilogue. It's the diary called Gwangju Diary by E.J.E., who was a participant in the uprising. Very famous book in South Korea. It was an underground book for many years, and then was finally published in the late 1980s. 1999, an English version was published by the University of California Press with a foreword by Bruce Cummings, who's a well-known historian of the Korean War. And then I have the epilogue called The View from Washington, where basically, the story we went through tonight, based on all the documentation I obtained, I tell the story. And so this new reprint of the book, my chapter is completely updated with information that I've obtained over the last 2 years, that sort of tells a much fuller story of the U.S. role, and it's actually worse than the U.S. role is actually worse than I originally thought, from what I've learned over the last couple of years, and then drawing on some CIA documents I've been able to find, and other sources. So I'm very excited for that to be out, because I think it gives, this book is really gives you, the diary itself is fantastic. It really tells you the human story of what happened inside Gwangju, and all the people that organized this uprising, what happened to them. But Bruce Cummings' essay is really great as well, and I hope mine is seen in the same way.
Great. I'm sure people will keep their eyes out. I certainly will. On that, Tim Shorrock, thanks for coming on the Korea Now podcast.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and interviewing me. It was great to do it.